There's a recording that Johnny Cash made in 1968 that most people have never heard. It wasn't meant for an album. It wasn't performed on stage. It was just Johnny, alone in a hotel room, somewhere between concerts, speaking into a tape recorder at 3 in the morning. His voice is rough, tired, slurred from whatever he'd taken to get through the day, and he's talking to someone who isn't there, his brother Jack. Jack had been dead for 23 years by then, killed in a sawmill accident when he was 15 years old. Johnny was 12 when it happened, standing beside their father when they got the news. On that tape, Johnny tells Jack he's sorry. Sorry he wasn't there that day. Sorry he survived when Jack didn't. Sorry he'd spent 2 decades trying to destroy himself because living felt like a betrayal when the better brother was gone. The tape was found years later, tucked away in a box of personal belongings. Johnny's family listened to it once and never played it again. It was too raw, too private, too painful. Because what Johnny Cash never told the world, what he barely told himself, was that his whole life was built on guilt. Guilt over his brother's death. Guilt over the pain he caused his family. Guilt over the pills and the drinking and the years he spent running from the one thing he needed most: forgiveness. Not from his fans, not from God, not even from his wife, June, who stood by him when no one else would, but from himself. And by the time he finally found it, so much had already been lost. This is the story of Johnny Cash's long walk through darkness and the quiet moment of grace that came almost too late to save him. If you grew up listening to country music in the 1950s and 60s, Johnny Cash was the voice of every working man in America. That deep, steady baritone, the boom chicka boom rhythm of the Tennessee Two behind him, songs about trains and prisons and hard times and redemption. He didn't sing pretty, he sang true. He was born J.R. Cash in 1932 in Kingsland, Arkansas, during the worst of the Great Depression. His family were sharecroppers, cotton farmers, who worked land they didn't own, barely scraping by. They moved to Des, Arkansas, when Johnny was 3, part of a New Deal resettlement program that gave poor families a chance at a fresh start. Life was hard, the work was brutal, but the Cash family had music. They sang gospel songs around the radio. Johnny's mother, Carrie, recognized something special in her son's voice early on. She encouraged him, believed in him. His older brother, Jack, was the golden child, smart, kind, destined for the ministry. Everyone said Jack would do great things. And then, on May 12th, 1944, Jack went to work at the high school agriculture shop on a Saturday morning. A table saw malfunctioned. The blade caught him across the midsection, nearly cutting him in half. He lived for a week in unimaginable pain before dying on May 20th, 1944. Johnny was 12 years old. He never got over it. He carried that loss into the Air Force, where he served in Germany in the early 1950s. He carried it into his first marriage to Vivian Liberto in 1954. He carried it into Memphis, where he walked into Sun Records in 1955 and auditioned for Sam Phillips. Sam Phillips, the man who discovered Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, heard something in Johnny's voice, something haunted, something real. Johnny's first single, Cry, 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 was a regional hit. His second, Folsom Prison Blues, made him a star. By 1956, I Walk the Line had made him a household name. He wasn't polished like the pop singers. He wasn't wild like Elvis or Jerry Lee. He was something different, a man in black who sang about sinners and prisoners and people who'd made mistakes. He connected with audiences because he understood struggle. He understood loss. He understood what it meant to carry something heavy that you couldn't put down. By the early 1960s, Johnny Cash was one of the biggest stars in country music. He had his own television show. He performed at the Grand Ole Opry. He toured constantly, playing sold-out shows across America. But behind the music, something was breaking. The pills had started innocently enough, just something to keep him awake on long drives between shows. But by 1961, Johnny was addicted. Amphetamines to stay up, barbiturates to come down, more and more until he couldn't function without them. His marriage to Vivian was falling apart. He was gone constantly, erratic when he was home. They had 4 daughters, Roseanne, Kathy, Cindy, and Tara. But Johnny was barely present. And then he met June Carter. June Carter came from country music royalty. Her mother was Maybelle Carter of the legendary Carter family. June had been performing since she was a child, knew every stage in the South, could play guitar, sing harmony, and make audiences laugh with her quick wit and natural charm. She met Johnny in 1956, backstage at the Grand Ole Opry. They were both married to other people, but there was something between them immediately, a connection neither of them could explain or ignore. By 1961, June was touring with Johnny regularly. She saw what the pills were doing to him. She saw the mood swings, the paranoia, the nights he couldn't sleep, and the days he could barely stand. She tried to help, tried to get him to slow down, see a doctor, talk to someone. Johnny wouldn't listen. He was spiraling, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop. The guilt over Jack's death had never left him. His father, Ray Cash, had once said, in anger, in grief, in a moment he probably regretted forever, that it should have been Johnny who died instead. Ray never apologized, never took it back, and Johnny never forgot. So he ran. He took more pills, he drank more, he showed up late to concerts or didn't show up at all. He got arrested multiple times, smuggling pills across the Mexican border, starting a forest fire in California that burned hundreds of acres, public intoxication. The Grand Ole Opry banned him in 1965 after he smashed the footlights during a performance. His record label threatened to drop him. His band was exhausted. His family was falling apart. Vivian finally filed for divorce in 1966. She took the girls and moved to California. Johnny barely fought it. He knew he'd failed them. By 1967, Johnny Cash was at rock bottom. He weighed 155 pounds, down from his normal 200. He was gaunt, hollow-eyed, barely recognizable. He lived in a cabin outside Nashville, alone, taking pills and waiting to die. And then, one night, he decided to make it official. He drove into Nickajack Cave, a massive cavern system in Tennessee. He planned to go deep inside, get lost in the darkness, and let the pills and the cold finish what he'd been trying to do for years. He crawled through the cave for hours, his flashlight growing dimmer, his body weakening. He wanted it to end, wanted the guilt, the pain, the exhaustion to finally stop. But something happened in that cave. He ran out of pills. The flashlight died. And in the absolute darkness, Johnny Cash had a moment of clarity. He didn't want to die. Not like this. Not alone. Not without trying, one more time, to be the man his mother believed he could be. The man Jack would have wanted him to be. He crawled back toward the entrance. It took hours. He was weak, disoriented, barely conscious. But he made it out. June Carter was waiting when he got home. She didn't ask where he'd been. She just looked at him and said, "It's time." Johnny nodded, and for the first time in years, he meant it. The comeback started slowly. June took Johnny to her parents' house. They prayed with him, sat with him, watched him shake and sweat through withdrawal. It was brutal, physically, emotionally, spiritually. But Johnny didn't run this time. He checked into a hospital, got clean, started therapy, began the long, painful process of rebuilding his life. By 1968, he was performing again. Not perfectly, not easily, but he was showing up. He was sober. He was present. And then came Folsom Prison. Johnny had always connected with prisoners, maybe because he'd been arrested himself, maybe because he understood what it felt like to be trapped, to make mistakes, to wonder if redemption was even possible. In January 1968, he recorded a live album at Folsom State Prison in California. It was raw, unpolished, real. The inmates loved it. Johnny fed off their energy. The album, at Folsom Prison, became one of the biggest hits of his career. It revitalized everything. Suddenly, Johnny Cash was relevant again, respected again. The Man in Black was back. He proposed to June Carter on stage in February 1960 in front of 7,000 people in London, Ontario. She said yes. They married on March 1st, 1968. June became his anchor. She toured with him, performed with him, kept him accountable. Their duet, Jackson, became a hit. So did If I Were a Carpenter. In 1969, Johnny launched The Johnny Cash Show on ABC, one of the first variety shows to feature country music on a major network. He brought on everyone: Bob Dylan, Louis Armstrong, Joni Mitchell, Neil Young. He broke down barriers between country and rock, folk and gospel. He recorded at San Quentin in 1969, another live prison album that became a massive success. The single, A Boy Named Sue, went to #1 on the country charts and crossed over to pop radio. Johnny Cash was bigger than ever, sober, successful, finally at peace, or so it seemed. But sobriety didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the years he'd missed with his daughters. It didn't repair the damage to his first marriage. It didn't bring back the time he'd lost to pills and paranoia and self-destruction. Roseanne, his oldest daughter, later wrote about those years, about waiting for her father to call and him not calling, about visits that were canceled, about the man who was a hero to millions but couldn't quite figure out how to be a father. Johnny tried. After he got sober, he reached out more, spent time with his girls, but the distance was there. The hurt was there. Forgiveness took time, and his relationship with his own father remained broken. Ray Cash never apologized for what he'd said about Jack, never acknowledged the pain those words had caused. He was proud of Johnny's success, proud to be the father of a famous son, but the emotional wound never healed. Johnny visited his parents when he could, sent money, made sure they were cared for, but the conversations were surface level, polite, distant. In 1985, Ray Cash died. Johnny sang at the show funeral. He wept. But even then, there was something unfinished between them, something that would haunt Johnny for the rest of his life. And then there was June. June saved him. Johnny said it constantly. He dedicated songs to her. He thanked her in interviews. He called her his angel, his lifeline, the reason he was still alive. But being married to Johnny Cash wasn't easy. Even sober, he was complicated, moody, driven. He toured constantly, spent weeks away from home, poured everything into his music. June supported him, but it took a toll. She had her own career, her own dreams, but she became Mrs. Johnny Cash first, and everything else second. She never complained publicly. She smiled. She performed beside him. She played the role of the devoted wife. But privately, there were moments of exhaustion, moments when she wondered if she'd given up too much. Still, she stayed, because she loved him, and because somewhere beneath all the complexity and the pain and the years of struggle, Johnny Cash was a man trying every single day to be better than he'd been the day before. It was late at night in 1997 at the Cash home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. Johnny couldn't sleep. He'd been diagnosed with autonomic neuropathy earlier that year, a degenerative nerve disease. His hands shook. His balance was off. Performing was getting harder. He sat in his study, looking through old photographs, pictures of his parents, pictures of Jack, pictures of his daughters when they were young. June found him there, tears running down his face. She sat beside him, didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, Johnny spoke. "I wasted so much time." June took his hand. "You did the best you could. It wasn't enough. It was enough for me." Johnny looked at her. This woman who'd stood by him through addiction, arrests, anger, depression, who'd never given up on him, even when he'd given up on himself. "I don't deserve you," June smiled. That same smile that had been lighting up stages for 40 years. "Lucky for you, love isn't about deserving." They sat there in the quiet, holding hands, two people who'd walked through fire together and somehow come out the other side. Johnny realized something in that moment. Forgiveness wasn't a single event. It wasn't something you earned or achieved or checked off a list. It was a process, a choice you made every day to forgive yourself for the mistakes, to accept that you couldn't change the past, to believe that grace was possible, even for people who'd spent years running from it. He thought about Jack, about the brother he'd lost, and the guilt he'd carried for 50 years. And for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, Jack would have forgiven him too. The turning point came in 2003, but it started years earlier. By the late 1990s, Johnny's health was failing. The neuropathy was worsening. He'd been hospitalized multiple times. Pneumonia, complications from diabetes, his body, worn down by decades of abuse and then decades of touring, was breaking down. But he kept recording. In 1994, he'd partnered with producer Rick Rubin for an album called American Recordings. It was stripped down, just Johnny and his guitar, singing old folk songs, gospel hymns, and a few new compositions. Critics loved it. A whole new generation discovered Johnny Cash. He won a Grammy. Suddenly, at 62 years old, he was cool again. More albums followed: Unchained, American 3, Solitary Man, each one darker, more introspective, more honest about mortality and regret and the long road home. In 2000, he recorded a cover of 9 Inch Nails' Hurt. The song was about addiction, self-destruction, the pain you cause the people who love you. It could have been written for Johnny Cash. The music video, directed by Mark Romanek, was devastating. It showed Johnny, old and frail, singing in his museum surrounded by artifacts from his life. June appeared briefly, watching him with a mixture of love and sadness. The video ended with Johnny closing the piano lid, a final note echoing into silence. It felt like a farewell, and in many ways, it was. June Carter Cash died on May 15th, 2003, following complications from heart surgery. Johnny was at her bedside. He held her hand. He told her he loved her. And then she was gone. The woman who'd saved his life. The woman who'd stood by him for 35 years of marriage and decades more of friendship before that. Johnny was shattered. He performed at her funeral, his voice breaking, his body barely able to stand. He sang Angel Band, one of June's favorite hymns. After the funeral, friends worried he wouldn't survive the grief. He lost weight, stopped eating, could barely get out of bed, but he went back to the studio one last time. He recorded more songs for what would become American Flora. The Man Comes Around. His voice was weak, fragile, but it carried a weight that was almost unbearable to listen to. He sang about death, about judgment, about standing before God and accounting for the life you'd lived. He sang hurt again in his mind, thinking of June, thinking of Jack, thinking of all the years he'd spent trying to outrun his own shadow. On September 12th, 2003, 4 months after June died, Johnny Cash passed away at Baptist Hospital in Nashville. He was 71 years old. The official cause was complications from diabetes, but everyone who knew him understood the real cause. He died of a broken heart. Here's what people don't understand about Johnny Cash. The Man in Black wasn't a persona. It was a confession. Johnny wore black because he identified with prisoners, with outcasts, with people who'd made mistakes and didn't know how to find their way back. He wore black because he understood darkness. He'd lived in it for years, but he also understood something else. That darkness doesn't have to be the end of the story. That redemption is possible. even for people who don't think they deserve it. That forgiveness, real, deep, lasting forgiveness, is the hardest work you'll ever do, and it's worth every moment of the struggle. Johnny Cash spent decades running from his brother's death, from his father's words, from his own guilt and shame. And when he finally stopped running, when he finally let people in, when he finally accepted that he was loved despite his failures, not because he'd earned it, but because grace doesn't work that way, he found peace. Not perfect peace, not easy peace, but real peace. The kind that lets you close your eyes at night and believe that tomorrow might be a little bit better than today. June gave him that. His faith gave him that. The music gave him that. But most importantly, he gave it to himself. He forgave himself for not being perfect, for making mistakes, for being human. And that forgiveness, quiet, hard-won, arriving almost too late, saved him in the end. They buried Johnny Cash beside June at Hendersonville Memory Gardens in Tennessee. Thousands came to the funeral. Chris Christopherson, Emmylou Harris, the Highwaymen, his daughters, his son, John Carter Cash, born to Johnny in June in 1970. They sang gospel songs. They shared stories. They wept. Roseanne Cash, his oldest daughter, spoke about her father with a mixture of love and honest reckoning. She talked about the pain he'd caused, the years he'd been absent, the struggle to forgive him. But she also talked about the man he became, the father who showed up later in life, who called more, who tried harder, who acknowledged his mistakes and worked every day to be better. She said that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it makes space for a future. And that's what her father had finally learned. The grave was simple, no elaborate monument, just two stones, side by side, Johnny and June. Together, the way they'd been since that day in 1968, when she stood by him and said, "It's time." In the years since, Johnny's music has only grown in stature. New generations discover him. The prison albums, the American recordings, hurt. They see a man who lived hard, fell hard, and somehow found his way back. But perhaps the most important legacy isn't the music. It's the lesson he left behind. That it's never too late to change, never too late to seek forgiveness, never too late to believe that grace is possible, even when you've spent years convinced you don't deserve it. Johnny Cash walked through darkness for decades, but he walked out. And in the end, that's what mattered most. Some stories aren't about perfection. They're about the slow, painful, beautiful work of becoming whole. And some stories stay with us forever. If this quiet story touched you, feel free to subscribe and join us for more forgotten American lives.